There is something you need to understand before we even begin talking about Mars, because I already know what you probably did the moment you saw this subject. You looked for your zodiac sign first. You glanced at the title, moved quickly through the opening, and searched for the names that might tell you whether this message belonged to you. Maybe you were hoping to see your sign there. Maybe you were quietly afraid that you would not. And perhaps there was that familiar little question underneath it all, the one you do not always say out loud. Is this finally about me? Am I one of the people who needs to pay attention? So let us remove that uncertainty immediately. 4 signs are standing closest to the center of what happens today: Cancer, Capricorn, Aries, and Libra. But do not mistake those 4 signs for an exclusive doorway that shuts everyone else out. Mars is not entering Cancer only for 4 people. Today, Tuesday, Mars leaves quick and mentally restless Gemini and crosses into Cancer, the sign connected with family, memory, emotional belonging, and the people we instinctively protect without announcing that we are doing it. Think about what happens when someone finally comes home after being away for a long time. The people sitting closest to the door may notice the arrival first, but the entire house feels the door open. The atmosphere changes. The temperature changes. Even the rooms that seemed quiet a moment earlier somehow feel different. That is the deeper meaning of this transition. The important question is not whether your name appears on a list of 4 signs. The important question is, what comes home with Mars when that door opens, and what part of your life will suddenly demand protection? That question matters because Mars entering Cancer does not create a simple division between people who are affected and people who are untouched. Instead, it changes the emotional climate through which action itself operates. From today forward, your motivation, your anger, your protective instincts, your determination, and the way you chase what you want all pass through a much more emotional layer. Every sign has something vulnerable somewhere in its life. Every person has something they would defend more fiercely than they would ever admit. Every person has a private place where one careless sentence can reach much deeper than intended. And the reason that place may already feel exposed today is written into the sky. Mercury is making a square to Chiron today, creating conditions where language can hurt more than the actual subject seems to justify. A casual remark can suddenly touch an old nerve. A simple disagreement can awaken a memory that has nothing to do with the present conversation. You may find yourself reacting to the emotional history behind a sentence instead of the sentence itself. At the same time, Venus is moving toward a deep trine with Pluto, while also stretching into a hazy opposition with Neptune. Attraction becomes stronger. Values become more refined. Desire becomes harder to separate from imagination. You may feel certain that you know what you want, only to discover that part of what you are pursuing is actually a picture you created in your mind. That does not mean the feeling is false. It means the emotional landscape is layered. Nothing about the current atmosphere is completely neutral. Mars is also completing its final movement through Gemini, forming a trine to the North Node and pulling you towards something that appears increasingly consequential, even if you still cannot put its meaning into words. That pull is the turning point. Today, the direction of your energy changes. Instead of being directed primarily outward toward arguments, choices, information, possibilities, comparisons, and mental activity, it begins turning inward toward attachment, loyalty, memory, emotional history, and the question of what feels like home. If you've been paying attention to the sky this week, you may already recognize the feeling beneath this transition. The last quarter, Moon in Taurus a few days ago, brought a sorting process. It asked you to recognize what you were continuing to carry, even though it no longer seemed valuable enough to deserve the space it occupied. Chiron then turned retrograde, reopening a healing thread that you may have believed was already finished. Now, Mars changes the temperature of your motivation itself. This is not random movement. It is a turning point in the way you act from what you feel. So instead of asking whether you made the list, ask yourself something much more revealing. If the door suddenly opened and someone walked into your private world carrying everything you have been trying not to feel, what would you instinctively protect? That is the territory Mars in Cancer is entering. Picture a soldier returning home after a battle that was fought almost entirely through words. He has spent weeks moving through arguments, debates, information, choices, and mental pressure. He arrives with his armor still on, but the room he enters is not a battlefield. It is a home filled with memories, attachments, tenderness, family patterns, and things that can be damaged simply because they matter. He still has strength. He still knows how to fight, but the environment is asking a different question. It is asking whether strength can become presence instead of constant defense. The warrior does not become weaker. The battlefield changes. And just before Mars crosses that threshold, it completes its trine to the North Node from the final degrees of Gemini. Think of that as the final transmission from the front lines. It is the last message sent from the territory of debate, argument, mental overload, and rapidly changing information. Mars in Gemini has been operating through speed. It has been about knowing what to say, knowing which option to choose, moving quickly, adapting quickly, thinking quickly, and using words like tools that can be placed precisely where they are needed. That chapter closes on Tuesday. What begins afterward requires an entirely different form of intelligence. Cancer is cardinal water. It initiates, but it initiates through feeling. Traditional astrology describes Cancer as the fall of Mars, and that phrase is often misunderstood. It does not mean Mars loses its power. It means Mars cannot rely on direct force in the same way. Willpower becomes relational. Action becomes protective. Anger becomes connected to attachment. Desire becomes connected to emotional safety. The warrior has not disappeared. The warrior has entered a landscape where the reason for fighting matters more than the ability to fight. This is why the transition can feel so personal. You may not simply want something anymore. You may feel that something matters. You may not simply disagree with someone. You may feel that something inside you is being threatened. You may not simply become frustrated when plans change. You may suddenly realize that the change has disturbed a deeper need for stability. This is the emotional architecture Mars is about to activate. Now look at the sky, at the exact moment of the crossing. When Mars enters Cancer today, the Moon is still in Cancer. For a brief period, they occupy the same sign. Then the Moon moves into Leo. By the end of Tuesday, the Sun, Moon, Mercury, and Jupiter are all gathered in Leo, while Mars stands alone at 0 degrees Cancer. The image is striking. 4 planets are shining in Leo, a sign associated with visibility, expression, confidence, recognition, and the desire to be seen, while Mars stands at the threshold of Cancer, carrying a much quieter and more private assignment. Imagine a brightly illuminated room filled with voices and attention, while someone stands alone in the darker entrance of a kitchen, trying to understand what needs to be protected before stepping forward. That contrast is one of the defining images of this entrance. Leo wants expression. Leo wants visibility. Leo wants the heart to speak openly and proudly. Cancer wants security. Cancer wants emotional shelter. Cancer wants to know that what is vulnerable will not be exposed carelessly. During the next 6.5 weeks, you may find yourself acting from a deeply private emotional place, while the world around you continues asking for performance, visibility, confidence, and expression. The skill will not be choosing one side and rejecting the other. The real skill will be allowing what is privately true to nourish what becomes publicly visible without sacrificing either one during the translation. And Mars does not enter this environment quietly. Later on Tuesday, Mercury opposes Pluto and forms a trine to Neptune. The mind goes deeper. Suspicion can rise. Confessions can surface. Imagination becomes stronger. Intuition can arrive with such intensity that dismissing it feels almost impossible. At the same time, Venus forms a trine to Uranus, creating the possibility that something within your relationships or personal value system suddenly needs more space, greater honesty, or access to an option you did not previously realize existed. So Mars arrives in a house that is already charged with electricity. The real question is what this warrior has come to defend. Forget the questions that keep you trapped in self-judgment. Do not begin with whether you are being too emotional. Do not begin with whether you are overreacting. Do not begin by asking why everything suddenly feels so personal. Ask something more useful. What is this feeling trying to protect? That is the question Mars in Cancer understands. Because underneath anger, there is often something much softer. The sharp reaction you experience when someone minimizes your effort may be protecting a need for recognition that you never learned how to request directly. The pressure you feel inside when someone changes plans without considering you may be protecting a need for security that was violated long before this particular situation appeared. The sudden urge to withdraw when someone gets too close may be guarding grief that has not yet found words. Mars knows how to pursue, cut through resistance, and defend. Cancer knows how to attach, shelter, remember, and preserve. When these forces occupy the same sign, the warrior and the protector become difficult to separate. Your task is to learn which one is actually holding the steering wheel in each moment. Protection that comes from love feels completely different from reactivity that comes from an old wound while pretending to be love. Think about the cancer shell. It is not necessarily a prison. It can function as a moving boundary, something you carry with you, something that can close when the environment becomes genuinely unsafe and open when your surroundings allow your real voice to emerge. The problem is not having a shell. The problem begins when you forget that you have one, when you forget how to open it, or when you keep it sealed for so long that the people outside eventually stop knocking. That distinction can become especially important during the 6.5 weeks ahead, because emotional defense can easily disguise itself as responsibility. You may tell yourself that you are protecting everyone when you are actually protecting an old fear. You may believe you are maintaining peace when you are actually avoiding a necessary emotional truth. You may convince yourself that silence is strength, when silence is really the only strategy you learned in an environment where your needs were rarely given room. And this is where the next layer begins to emerge, without moving beyond the territory. Mars in Cancer is already opening. The anger that you carry may not have started with you. Family systems can contain unspoken rules about who is allowed to be angry, who must keep the peace, who takes care of everyone else, whose needs are postponed, and whose feelings are named last. Mars entering Cancer can bring that inherited emotional pattern closer to the surface, not because the transit is asking you to create more conflict, but because it changes the way you recognize what your anger has been protecting all along. That recognition is where the next part of this story begins. Mars moving through Cancer can bring family patterns back into the present, not as distant memories that you calmly analyze from a safe distance, but as living situations that unfold through real conversations, real people, and real emotional reactions. Something you thought belonged to another generation can suddenly appear in the way you respond to someone standing in front of you. A rule you never consciously agreed to may reveal itself through the way you take responsibility, the way you absorb someone else, pain, the way you keep quiet to prevent conflict, or the way you become fiercely defensive when someone you love is threatened. The deeper purpose is not to find someone to blame for what was handed down to you. The deeper purpose is to recognize the inheritance clearly enough to decide what continues through you and what ends with you. That distinction matters because Mars in Cancer can awaken one of its greatest gifts, fierce loyalty. You may discover that you are extraordinarily brave when someone else needs you. You may become the person who acts immediately when a loved one is vulnerable. The friend who appears at the hospital without needing to be asked twice. The person who stands between someone else and humiliation. Or the person who will defend another human being's dignity long before you think about defending your own. There is enormous strength in that instinct. But the developmental challenge of this transit is to turn some of that courage inward. If you would protect someone you love without hesitation, you have to learn to extend that same protection toward yourself. If you would never tell someone you care about to tolerate what you have been tolerating, you have to become willing to notice the contradiction. Mars in Cancer asks you to stop treating yourself as the person who can always go last. Now let us return to the 4 signs that stand closest to this transition, because they deserve a more precise look. If your Sun or Ascendant is in Cancer, Capricorn, Aries or Libra, the arrival of Mars in Cancer activates the cardinal cross of your chart through conjunction, opposition or square. You are likely to notice the movement earlier and experience it more directly than many other signs. This does not mean everyone else is excluded. It means that you are closer to the doorway when the door opens. For Cancer Sun or Cancer Ascendant, Mars enters the 1st house, the territory of the body, identity, action, instinct, and personal direction. That makes this intensely personal. Your desire becomes harder to ignore. Your impatience becomes more visible. Your courage becomes something you have to embody instead of merely think about. Your anger may become harder to outsource or rationalize. Your competitive fire may become impossible to hide behind other people's needs. For approximately 6.5 weeks, you are being asked to take responsibility for the way your energy moves through your own life. The assignment is not brute force. It is clean assertion. Say no before you disappear into taking care of everyone else. Ask directly for what you need before silently measuring whether another person will prove their loyalty. Move before resentment becomes so cold and hardened that you no longer recognize what started it. Your opening arrives quickly. The day after Mars enters Cancer, on Wednesday, Mars forms a sextile to Chiron. That creates a manageable opportunity for repair. It is not necessarily the moment for a dramatic confession or an enormous emotional performance. It is better understood as a practical opening, a chance to do one brave thing differently. Pay close attention to what follows, because later in the week and beyond, the quincunx to Pluto and the square to Neptune will challenge whether the method you choose actually matches the motive underneath it. Keep later decisions transparent and reversible. If you are angry, do not disguise that anger as certainty. If you need space, say that you need space, rather than disappearing and expecting someone else to understand the reason. If you want reassurance, ask for reassurance, rather than creating a test that another person does not know they are taking. For Capricorn Sun, or Capricorn Ascendant, Mars moves across the zodiac from you and enters the 7th house, the realm of partners, clients, competitors, contracts, and the relational mirror that shows you what is happening underneath your own surface. Other people may suddenly become the clearest reflection of feelings you have been carrying without fully acknowledging them. A partner may need protection. A client may press against a boundary. A competitor may reveal a desire you were not ready to admit. A contract may force you to define what you are actually willing to give and what you are no longer willing to surrender. None of this automatically means separation. It means the relationship can no longer remain emotionally abstract. You are being asked to protect the relationship from the problem rather than turning the person into the problem. Put agreements into writing. Define the conflict before responding to it. Make the issue specific enough that both people can see what is actually being discussed. And if you notice yourself becoming drawn toward a cold withdrawal, pay attention to that impulse. The withdrawal itself may be the signal. Something inside you wants to be met, but vulnerability can feel so expensive that rigidity appears safer. The shield can become familiar enough that you forget it is still a shield. For Aries Sun or Aries Ascendant, this transition carries a particularly personal significance because Mars is your ruling planet and Mars is changing signs. The tone of your entire forward movement changes with it. Cancer occupies your fourth house, bringing attention toward home, roots, parents, family systems, private foundations, and the hidden structure beneath your public life. This is the place where you belong when nobody is watching. This is the emotional ground beneath the identity that the outside world sees. That is why your specific warning involves Neptune in Aries. About 1 week after Mars enters Cancer, Mars forms a square to Neptune. That aspect can blur the difference between an actual threat and a fear that has been projected onto the present. It can make it harder to distinguish between fighting for something meaningful and fighting simply because remaining still feels unbearable. Do not bring a public conflict into your home merely because home feels like the safest place to release it. Stabilize the foundation first. Make the basic needs functional before resentment starts writing the story for you. Ask what actually needs attention in the home, the family system, or your private life before you assume that intensity itself is evidence of danger. For Libra Sun or Libra Ascendant, Mars enters the 10th house, the area of career, reputation, authority, responsibility, and public visibility. The sign-based square presses against the familiar tension between keeping the peace and protecting what is personally important. Venus, your ruling planet, is currently in Libra and is moving through a trine to Pluto, an opposition to Neptune, and a trine to Uranus around the time of this entrance. That means relationships, values, image, freedom, and professional decisions can become intertwined. The remedy is advocacy without appeasement. Charm is a tool. It is not surrender. If you agree to something only to preserve harmony and then explode a week later, the explosion will cost far more than the honest refusal would have cost at the beginning. Advocate for your team. Renegotiate a role that has quietly consumed more of your private life than you intended to give. Establish a boundary with a client or authority figure before resentment chooses the boundary for you, because resentment almost always draws the line in the wrong place. Now there is another part of this story that the simple 4-sign list cannot fully explain. Being closest to Mars does not mean being the only person who hears the door open. There are other placements that can catch the first wave, even though a simplified list rarely has room to mention them. If you have Taurus placements in the early degrees, including your Sun, Ascendant, or a natal planet in the early degrees, you can be touched by the Mars-Chiron sextile. On Wednesday, Chiron is positioned in early Taurus, and Mars, reaching toward Chiron from 0 degrees Cancer, creates an opening that is practical and specific. A wound involving the body, confidence, stability, money, or self-worth can suddenly reveal a path towards something manageable. Not a miracle cure, not a promise that everything disappears overnight. One usable step. One concrete action that allows healing to become something you participate in, rather than something you endlessly think about. If you have Aquarius placements in the early degrees, you can be caught by the Mars-Pluto quincunx later in the week. Pluto is positioned in early Aquarius, and when Mars forms this awkward adjusting angle, the subject becomes power. More specifically, it becomes the relationship between personal authority, the transformation you are trying to build, and the workload you carry every day. A responsibility that was supposed to serve your life may have quietly started controlling the person who was supposed to benefit from it. That is where adjustment becomes necessary. And there is an important limit to any list like this. Your natal degree, your house placements, and the rest of your birth chart determine the actual intensity of a transit, far more precisely than a solar sign ranking ever can. Cancer, Capricorn, Aries, and Libra are the clearest cardinal group for this transition. They are not an exhaustive list of everyone who can feel it. If something in this message has awakened a reaction inside you, Pay attention to that reaction. Take what is useful, work with it. Trust the part that becomes clearer through observation, rather than the part that demands immediate drama. If nothing in you responds, you do not need to force yourself into the story. The house is always larger than the title can describe. And this brings us to the uncomfortable side of protection. Protection can quietly become control. The same people who feel a transit most strongly can also be the people most capable of turning their protective instincts into weapons without realizing that the weapon is in their hands. Everyone else is capable of the same pattern in a different form. So before you become comfortable simply knowing where you sit at the table, look at what happens when the soldier refuses to put the shield down. Later in the week, Mars forms a quincunx to Pluto. Power can move underground when direct confrontation feels too exposing. The behavior can become subtle enough that you may initially call it care. Silence can become punishment instead of processing. Help can arrive with invisible conditions attached. Questions that sound innocent can secretly become loyalty tests. Decisions can be made for everyone in the name of what is supposedly best for everyone, without allowing anyone else to participate in the decision. Caring for other people can gradually become a cage built by the protector, locked by the protector, and eventually forgotten as a cage, because the person inside has become so accustomed to calling it responsibility. About 1 week later, Mars forms a square to Neptune, and that is where motives can become especially difficult to read. Anger can transform into avoidance. Forward movement can dissolve into vague restlessness. A rescue fantasy can replace a clearly defined objective. You might find yourself fighting intensely for something, while being unable to explain exactly what it is when someone asks you directly. You only know that it feels urgent. You only know that it feels personal. You only know that it seems like it should not require an explanation. But something that cannot be named cannot be targeted clearly, and the mental atmosphere around the entrance makes that warning even more important. At the moment Mars enters Cancer, Mercury opposes Pluto and forms a trine to Neptune. The emotional story can become so vivid that it feels indistinguishable from verified fact. Suspicion can borrow the vocabulary of intuition. A physical feeling of certainty can become so powerful that questioning it feels almost like betraying yourself. But a powerful feeling is still not identical to evidence. Verify before accusing. Verify before resigning. Verify before making a purchase, making a promise, or destroying a bridge you may need later. The distinction is actually simple once you slow down enough to see it. Protection is proportionate, direct, and connected to a real need for safety. Reactivity assumes danger before checking, punishes the person who happened to touch the wound, and treats emotional intensity as a universal permission to escalate. Your feeling can be completely valid while your chosen action is still disproportionate. That gap between valid emotion and appropriate response is where much of the real work of the next 6.5 weeks will happen. So now we reach the quietest part of the message, and that quietness is intentional. The loudest expression of a transit is not always the most useful one. Often the most valuable response is the smallest specific action you can take before confusion arrives. The cleanest opening of the week comes the day after Mars enters Cancer. On Wednesday, August 12th, Mars forms a sextile to Chiron. A new moon gathers in Leo. Mercury forms a sextile to Uranus. That combination deserves careful attention. There is an opportunity for practical repair, a fresh emotional beginning, and an unexpected insight or conversation arriving within the same day. It is not a guarantee that something will change for you automatically. It is a door. A sextile creates an opening, but it does not carry you through it. Mars sextile Chiron means the opportunity to approach something tender with courage is available. You still have to participate. Healing does not simply descend from the sky while you remain passive. This is a window in which one manageable, courageous action may meet less resistance than it normally would. Repair what is genuinely repairable. Try a different response in a conversation that usually follows the same exhausting script. Start an experiment rather than announcing a revolution. And be precise about the new moon. It follows the entrance of Mars. It does not cause the entrance. These are separate layers of the same week, but together they form a useful sequence. Tuesday changes the private source of motivation. Wednesday gives that internal shift an opportunity to become a visible intention. Let outward movement grow from something emotionally authentic rather than from a performance designed to prove that you have transformed. That is the assignment. Before you protect someone else, before you withdraw from someone else, before you make a decision that rearranges another person's life alongside your own, say one genuinely protective sentence out loud. Not silently inside your head, out loud. It can be as simple as saying that you need reassurance. It can be saying that you are angry about one specific thing. It can be saying that you need time before you can answer. It can be saying that you can help with one part but not another. One clear sentence can accomplish more than an entire week of silent mental spiraling because it names the need. Once the need has a name, Mars no longer has to protect a secret. Mars can act on a truth. It also gives the other person something real to respond to, instead of leaving them with silence that they have to interpret. And people rarely interpret silence accurately when emotion is already present. This simple act costs very little compared with what can happen when a need remains buried until resentment takes over and writes the entire script. If you need a physical channel while the words are still forming, this transit has room for that too. Cook something connected to memory. Secure something in the home that has become loose or neglected. Have the honest conversation at the kitchen table that you have rehearsed everywhere except at the kitchen table. Move your body before anger decides how your body will move for you. Feel the emotion completely, then give it a direction that actually matches the situation. Mars will remain in Cancer for approximately 6.5 weeks. This is not merely a weekend mood. There is enough time here to learn something real. There is enough time to interrupt a pattern that once seemed permanent. There is enough time to discover which protections genuinely serve you and which ones exist primarily to protect fear. The instruction is simple, even when following it is difficult. Feel it fully. Do not numb it. Do not minimize it. Do not pretend the emotion is irrational simply because it arrived without asking permission. Name it precisely. Do not name the entire story you have built around it. Do not immediately assign a villain. Find the actual need underneath the armor. Then respond proportionately. Protect what is truly vulnerable without turning vulnerability itself into a weapon that keeps everyone at a distance. Let the home become a foundation for action rather than a bunker built against reality. Let loyalty remain a choice you make consciously rather than a debt someone else collects without your agreement. And finally, allow the soldier to place the shield against the wall. He does not need to hold it at that table. You do not need to hold yours there either. What this house asks from you is not endless strength. It asks for the quieter courage to remain, to feel, to name what is true, and to choose presence anyway. Watch Wednesday carefully. The Mars-Chiron sextile alongside the new moon in Leo creates a small but genuine opportunity, a chance to repair something you have only been carrying, and to allow private courage to finally enter visible life. Notice what rises to the surface. Sit with it before acting on it. Trust the impulse that is specific rather than the impulse that is dramatic. And if you began this story by wondering whether you belonged inside the circle or outside it, understand what this entire passage has been trying to show you. You were never standing outside the house. The door was never closed to you. The next 6.5 weeks are asking you to decide what deserves your protection, what deserves your honesty, and what no longer deserves to be carried forward simply because it was handed to you. Enter Tuesday with that awareness, and let the next movement of the story begin from there.